Paul, the Gentile whisperer. Paul's background and education greatly influenced his methodology in ministering to the Gentile assemblies. He was raised in Tarsus, which was temporarily ruled by the Stoics during his childhood, perhaps his formative years. Such a heavy presence of the Hellenistic lifestyle and philosophy in Paul's immediate surroundings meant he was groomed in the optimal environment for becoming the ideal candidate to minister to the Greeks, the champion of the Jews, sent to do battle with the superthinkers. Such a role required exceptional oratory abilities, mental as well as situational flexibility, and a sort of linguistic gymnastics that philosophers often employed in attempts to answer and defend the complex existential questions and ideas of their time. His appointment to the position, while being the obvious choice in hindsight, was met with incredulity and some disbelief by the prophet Ananias. Others hearing him speak were astonished at his 180-degree turn on the topic of the Messiah. Understandably so, given he had just arrived in Damascus after petitioning the high priests to imprison the men and women he had now joined ranks with. Strange and unusual behavior indeed. Regardless, he succeeded and flourished in his new position. Many Greeks converted to the primitive Christian faith under his tutelage, and a number of assemblies were stood up due to his evangelism. Paul risked life and limb to establish and grow his ministry. The painstaking and precarious lengths he traveled, literally and figuratively, speak volumes to his motivation to serve, his conviction in Yah's word, his commitment to the job, and his faith in Yeshua the Messiah. But was it enough to cancel out his former disdain for the men he had begun to love and call his brothers? Paul's message to the Gentile community was clear. To them. It confused his countrymen enough that Peter and James were forced to address his writings with their own assemblies to reassure them that the message, while foreign to their ears, was indeed the same message that Yeshua had commanded them to share. His letters were just written for a different audience and should be left alone unless one is similarly or sufficiently skilled in that discipline to be edified and not led astray by them. Paul himself warned his readers not to entertain the ideas of the philosophically minded, as they have the potential to overcomplicate the simplicity of salvation via the Messiah. Despite these warnings against hubris, some Gentiles became so confident in their understanding of his epistles that they eventually misused his words to justify their separation from the church and support their argument that the laws did not apply to them, even though this position was in stark opposition to the Torah and Yeshua's teachings. They became lawless and taught others to do the same. The self-serving bias toward their own intellectual superiority, ironically fueled by their own ideas on their mental prowess, was indeed their downfall. Paul even called out this penchant for taking control directly, in the hopes that they would be keen to look out for and guard against it. Even though Paul did exactly what he was supposed to, and all he could do to mitigate the dangers, his efforts ultimately led to the true doctrine being outlawed, oppression of the Jews, blasphemy, and numerous other spiritual infractions. Was he at fault, or was Yah making a point? Either way, it is this author's belief that had he known the outcome, he would have done things the same. I would be willing to argue that he knew the likely outcome, given the fact that he says, "Do not consider yourself to be superior to the root." Paul was aware of the power contained in the law, and he was well acquainted with the influence of philosophy. He knew that providing them the tools to combine both disciplines was a risk. Perhaps it was one he was expected to take, evidenced by the fact that he alone was chosen to minister to the Gentiles. This stands out as another demonstration of how obedient we are to be. Do what is expected of you at all times, despite what you know, suspect, or believe to be the outcome. That takes tremendous faith, which, if you know anything of human nature, it is not our strong suit. Paul's faith functions to set him apart from his Greek counterparts. because despite their similarities in methods of thinking, he doesn't succumb to its seductive powers. His demonstration of that faith serves to testify against his philosophical peers, who failed to guard their hearts and purposefully exhibited their defiance to the world. Was that the plan all along? The Council at Nicaea can be considered the birth of the Neo-Christian Church. The defense of the Trinitarian view and canonization of the patristical interpretation of Paul's epistles took place at this meeting. In essence, the patristics convened among themselves to make judgments upon something over which they had no authority, and therefore no power to change. Surely a testament to their limited understanding and boldness in ignorance. Even more shocking is their disregard and disposal of the hope of salvation that came through the very doctrine and covenant into which they were grafted. From death to life, to death once more, forever. Clearly ignoring Paul's warning, they didn't only separate from the faith, they sought to establish their supremacy by labeling the true faith as heresy, and wrote extensively, one could say excessively and obsessively, on the subject. They took the time to document their gradual detachment, providing more than sufficient evidence to support anyone's charge against them for being hubristic and antinomianistic by nature. This nature facilitated the emergence of the Neo-Christian faith, which has been so cleverly enlisted to confuse and deceive masses of Yah's people, while simultaneously providing opportunities for those who truly want to serve Elohim to choose truth over tradition, life over lies, service to God over serving themselves. It is a choice we all have to make and keep making until the breath of life returns to its source.
Well, we have with us today in our studio our essayist, Sister Lael Bat Yisrael of NCCI Universum, the writer and reader of today's essay, Paul the Gentile Whisperer. Sister Lael is a trained behavioral scientist, but most profoundly a Sinaticist who has given us a little of her time today. Shalom, sweet sister.
Shalom.
This was a beautiful profile on Paul and his influence on the Gentiles. It also helps us to understand his gospel on how it was corrupted by the Gentiles of the 2nd century. Gentiles like Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Jerome, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and Martin Luther. Gentiles who became the architects of modern Christianity between the 2nd and 16th centuries. So I just wanted to take a little of your precious time this evening to ask you a few questions. And my first question to you is, what should our audience glean from this essay? What should we take away from this essay?
One can probably grab several things, but I'll just mention a couple. The first being that when I study a subject and I truly understand it, a narrative usually emerges. And maybe it's because as a child I read a lot of books and stories. So my mind automatically just creates a story out of something. And in this case, the story that emerged was that of a man that was chosen to do something so remarkable. But what was remarkable about it is the fact that up until the point that Yeshua appears to him and blinds him, he was doing the exact opposite of what he was charged to do. Here we have a man who's, up until that point, his sole purpose was to destroy Yeshua's ministry, to stop it, to kill it in its tracks. But then he is charged to spread it, to expand it, to continue that message after Yeshua has passed. And it's remarkable that he takes up this charge and changes his life completely. It's a theme that we see in the Bible of Yah using the most unlikely of figures to represent him. Those that seem unqualified or more likely to get in the way and hinder the progress of Yah's will. But Yah is so amazing that in every instance he proves victorious. And it makes a very strong point that this is a God that is more powerful than anything that we have in our abilities. He is the El of the impossible.
Okay.
It's a huge flex, honestly.
Yeah, and I found the essay poignantly written, succinctly written, but with so much substance and depth. You canvassed a lot about Paul, the neo-Christian genre, so to speak, giving us a lot of insight, rich insight, to help us to appreciate who Paul is and how the Gentiles use the Pauline epistles as a template to construct their own theology.
Yeah. And that's the next thing that I wanted to communicate, is that, Paul is subconsciously lauded as this liberator, the one that freed us from the bondage of Yah's laws, when that is not what he did at all.
Right, exactly.
Few of us truly understand what he was sent to do. So with this essay, I wanted to point the reader, the listener, to the relative simplicity of what he did. The language in the Bible isn't exactly straightforward, but most of us are used to reading narratives that are written in our own style of speaking.
Yep.
So that's what I tried to do here. I tried to transform it so as to paint the scene for others.
Okay, all right. And so that essentially covers why it was important for you to write this essay on Paul and his influence on the Gentiles. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. I mean, I was inspired to write like any other artist would be inspired to create anything, and not wanting to miss an opportunity to edify Yah's people, I had to write it. But I also wanted to do my part in setting the record straight, because Paul's reputation is, it's mangled. It's so sullied at this point.
Great.
He's he's accused of blasphemy on a weekly basis.
Yeah, right.
He is reported to have done and said things that he didn't do or say.
Right. Yeah.
And I wanted to make sure that, the listeners have an opportunity to really hear what his message was.
Yeah, if I could speak to that just for a second, because you actually hit it right on the head. In the book of Acts, James and some of the other apostles essentially called him to the carpet to say, you're teaching against the Torah. You're teaching against the traditions of the fathers. You're telling the Israelite community not to obey the Torah.
Yeah, they called him out.
Yeah, and this wasn't Paul's ministry, and Paul had to argue several times that this wasn't his ministry.
Right.
It was misconstrued by, by people who didn't understand his argument, didn't understand his audience, etc. And so I just wanted to add to that. That was very important for you to bring out, and it's something that really touched me as well as the other listeners.
I want to mention one other thing too with that, is in giving Paul, putting him in the spotlight for all of this, it sort of it minimizes the authority and the sovereignty of our Creator, because the credit for salvation of the Gentiles is given to Paul, a man who at one point called himself Yeshua's prisoner.
Yeah.
So he's not even, under his own authority at this point.
Yeah.
He is bound to another man.
Excellent.
And to give him the credit for that, it's, I don't even have words for it.
Right. Well, it's a mischaracterization of Paul's agenda, Paul's mission. It's a misapplication of, who Paul was as a servant and disciple. Yeah.
And the people that he was ministering to, you mentioned before, they just did not understand. And, neo-Christians need to really get that fact that what they're reading the doctrine that they're following was developed by people that did not understand.
The patristics.
They did not understand.
Right.
And so we need to have a little bit of mercy and pity on them and not lift them up so high.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Okay. All right. Well, I know your time is precious, so I have one last question, if you would indulge me.
Of course.
This is an important question. How should we move forward with this information on Paul and the neo-Christian faith? How do we move forward? Where do we go from here?
My advice to anyone and everyone really is to question everything. Question everything that you're told, not just in church, but even in your home and at school. Question everything until the answer that you get is so rock solid and unambiguous. Most neo-Christians are sold on this feel-good doctrine, the feel-good factor, and the God of the universe does not exist to make humans feel good. He exists when nothing else does. And so our jobs, our goals should be to try to understand what it requires to exist with him. What does he require to be a part of his world? To know without any doubt what he requires allows us to guide our feet in the right direction. So moving forward, I would advise everyone to just question what you're being led to believe about Paul's epistles and anything in the Bible. Challenge your teachers to make it make sense. Because nowadays, and probably throughout history, we're seeing how easy it is to be misled. And especially when our situations are dire, when we're desperate for a way out. And these days, a lot of people are in pain. A lot of people are suffering. And that pain and suffering is being exploited, and your teachers are obligated to teach you and help you learn. When you learn, you grow. However, this just have faith business is throwing lives away, and believers of this doctrine are not growing.
Right. Just have faith. We're under grace. Right.
They're missing out on the transformative nature of Yah's law.
Yes.
So if you're not changing, you're not growing, you're not becoming who Yah wants you to be. And so you're missing out on the possibility of salvation.
So what I hear you saying is what we fully embrace. You are advising everybody in the world who's listening to this Sinaitic podcast and your essay to embrace Isaiah 8:20, to the law and to the prophets.
Yes.
If any man speaks not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. So, lay people, Bible students, we have to inspect what we believe God expects of us. And so we have to inspect our doctrine. We have to inspect the teachings. Whoever's teaching, we need to make sure that it harmonizes with both the Old and the New Testament, so to speak, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And we can't add anything to it, can't take anything away from it, and neither can doctrinal suppositions be forced. It has to flow naturally from the Word of God, right?
It has to be supported.
Beautiful. Oh, man, I have so many more questions, but everybody, this is it. We're going to allow our sister to leave and go jump on some other essays. And when I tell you she has a lot of essays, I guess you would say, as we would say, irons in the fire. Is that right? Irons in the fire. Well, she has a lot of essays in the hopper, and I just cannot wait to get her back here in the studio so we can do a review of her latest essay. We want to thank you for tuning in to NCCI Sinaitic Podcasts and Essays, and thank our writer and essayist, Sister Lael Bat Yisrael, for sitting down with us today to help us understand her motivation for this beautifully constructed essay on Paul. And so if you would like to have more information on this topic, Our beautiful listeners, please visit our website or enroll in our Sinaitic Light Bible Study program, which is free to you. You can have access to the information in which Sister Lael has constructed her essays from. May the blessings of Yah be with you, and let's remain focused and diligent on imaging our Father Yah for his glory. Shalom.